My name is Kyler. I'm one of the pastors on staff here. Been on staff here for about 3 years, and I oversee our college and young adults ministry. And really honored to get to share with us here during week 2 of our Reclaim the Table series. And man, what a treat it was to have Pastor Brad Leach with us last weekend from City Life Church. He kicked this thing off the right way, talking about how to participate with God to see miracles happen in the world around us. And I know it's only been 1 week of this series, but I've got to be honest, I love it already. I really, really do, because with each message in this series, there's a discussion guide available on the app, or even on your way out, you'll see a discussion guide there where we get to just dive a little bit deeper into these messages that we're going to be speaking on over the next couple of weeks. And summer is busy, life is busy, there's a lot of distractions, but we're encouraging and pushing, man, let's reclaim the table this summer. Let's dive in a little bit deeper to these messages, have topics of faith, discussions of faith around the dinner table with our family and with our households. And so that's really what the vision behind this series is all about. We highly encourage you to participate with that. I know my wife and I did that this past week, and there were some really amazing conversations that came out of that. And this week, we want to talk about a slightly different topic, and I want to talk to you tonight and this weekend about overcoming rejection and how we can do that. And I thought I would start the message off with one of the more significant moments of rejection in my life. I remember it was 4th of July weekend 2 years ago, and I had just gotten back from a missions trip that had in the state of Utah that had all but confirmed that this girl that I had met a couple months prior was absolutely worth pursuing, and I should ask her out. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. We're talking about rejection, and you're talking about a story about asking a girl out. I know where this story is going already. Hang on, we're going to get there. So we had gone on this trip. I had met her like in February of 2017, and we were on this trip together, and I just saw her serve, and I was like, man, this girl, I've got to ask her out. And so we got back on a Monday night from the trip, and I just kept thinking, man, before this moment goes, I've got to ask this girl out on a date, and I've got to do it as soon as possible before it fades away. And so I knew that I would see her here at church that upcoming weekend. And you're like, Kyler, did you really ask a girl out at church? Hold up, let me get to the end of the story. So that was the plan. Service had ended. It was 4th of July weekend. Everybody's making their way out, holiday plans, and I'm standing out there in the concourse. I'm having a conversation with someone, and I see her begin to make her way out the door. And so I very quickly weaseled my way out of that conversation, and I just darted over to her as confident as could be and asked her boldly out on a date. And I said, you know what? I really like to get to know you on this trip, and I was wondering if it would be possible, if I could take you out for dinner or coffee sometime and just get to know you a little bit better. And you want to know what her response was to me? She said, no, I'm kind of seeing someone. Okay. I did not anticipate that. Nowhere in my mind was the possibility of no even an answer. Maybe that was my own fault for walking up that confidently, but I had not prepared for that scenario. I said, there's absolutely no way, this is arrogant, that this girl is not into me, and so she's absolutely going to say yes. And so what do you do in a moment like that? I did what any normal person would do, and I probably played it off a lot smoother in my head than it came across. But I was like, oh, that's awesome for you. I'm so happy that you're seeing someone. Wow. Please get me out of this conversation. I hate this. And that now's probably a good time in the story to let you know that this mystery woman is not my wife of 13 months. Did you know that? Yes. I won at the end of the day. But my wife, first time I asked her out, flat out told me no, and it's not something that she likes to laugh about. I think it's funny now, but let me tell you, 2 years ago, in July of 2017, it was not funny because, like I said, it was the holiday weekend. I had about a 4.5-hour drive down to Maryland. I was going to spend it with some friends from college. And what's amazing to me about that moment, when she said no, in an instance, all of the self-confidence, all of the self-esteem, like everything that I had in me thinking, I'm a decent-looking guy, why wouldn't a girl want to go out with me, sapped in that exact moment. And it left. And I remember thinking that entire drive, I'm never asking a girl out in person ever again. Next time this happens, I'm going 21st century style. It's happening over text, or I'm going into the direct messages on Instagram, and I'm going to do it because I can't face personal rejection like that face to face ever again. I mean, that was humiliating. It was shameful, and you're just trying to work your way out of it. But there was something I learned in that moment about rejection, and what I find so interesting about it is this. It not only robbed me of strength and confidence in that moment there, But what it did was for the future, it took me out of the game of like ever wanting to step forward and doing something again, because rejection has a really powerful way of not only impacting the present in our lives, but also impacting the future. And I know rejection is not something that just I experience or only a select few of us experience, but rejection is a very common emotion and experience, because at some point in each of our lives, this happens to us, where we look in the mirror and what we see or what we hear or what we tell ourselves is, I don't quite measure up. I don't know if I'm worthy of love. I don't know if I'm wanted. I'm damaged beyond what is acceptable. And a lot of this stems from things that people have said to us in the past or people have done to us in the past. And what it has done is cast a shadow on our future. And we never want to step out again or move towards that direction again because of the pain that is associated with that event. And many of us walk around carrying this nagging doubt, wondering if we measure up, wondering if we're enough, wondering if we're really, really wanted, if people really loved us, are we really accepted by this group of friends or this group of people? And here's the unfortunate reality that so many of people in life never learn to move beyond the rejection that they experience. So many people never learn to live beyond it. And what it does, it becomes a hindrance from ever really moving forward in life. And rejection can happen in so many different ways, right? I mean, we've got the parent whose approval just always seems a little bit out of reach. And it doesn't matter what age you are, that can be prominent at any time in your life. Or there's the significant moments in life of exclusion. Or maybe you weren't invited to the party, or that group of friends went and hung out and didn't invite you, and that wounded you to your core. Or, growing up, who remembers trying out for the sports team, or maybe you tried out for the drama club and you didn't quite make the team, didn't make the audition, and it becomes a wound of rejection in your life. Or, not getting the promotion, being passed up for that. Or maybe it's the significant moments of insult in life where you've been laughed at. You've been made fun of for something. Maybe you've been gossiped about or even been betrayed by one of your closest friends. And man, that wound of rejection, it hurts because it feels like you've been pushed away. Or even the more serious moments in life as you get older where, there's the breakup, or there's the divorce, or there's adultery within marriage, or there's abandonment for some reason, or there's, neglect or abuse, or even the things that people have said about you. You're not tall enough, pretty enough, smart enough, rich enough, wise enough, whatever it is. Rejection can happen in so many different ways, and because it can happen in so many ways, I know this, that rejection is a common wound. None of us is immune. I wish there was a point that we could hit in life where it was like, oh man, I'm above this now. The opinions of other people, they don't bother me anymore. You could say whatever you want to be, but no, unfortunately, we never hit a point in life where we make enough money or our status becomes so high that we move beyond rejection and being able to experience that. It's an incredibly common wound. And I also know this about rejection, that often the moments where we've been rejected in life, the moments of pain from our past because of things that people have said or things that people have done, they often become defining moments for us in life. In fact, even as I'm talking, I'm sure there are memories that are coming up in your mind right now of things that people have said to you, things that people have done to you, and those memories are associated with pain, with a lot of emotional heaviness, even shame for some different things, and then, fear about stepping out for the future. And because of that, I also know this about rejection, that because there's often fear associated with putting yourself back out there or ever putting yourself in that situation again, rejection can become one of those things that limits us from ever moving forward in life. It limits us from ever moving forward to even be used by God. I mean, this isn't just something that is true in our everyday life of like, okay, cool, career, family, relationships. Yeah, there's rejection. But this even comes if you're in this room and you call yourself a Christian or you've been following Jesus for any amount of time. You've seen how rejection has played into that, because I know I can think back of moments in my life where people have said something to me. I don't think you're so good at that. Or, I don't know if you'll ever actually quite amount up to that. Or I would rather this person do that because I don't think you're quite good enough for that. I can see how that has even played in to times where I feel like God has asked me to step out and do something. And I'm like, ooh, I don't know, because someone spoke that over me a couple years ago, and they didn't think I was quite good enough for that. Because rejection, man, it infiltrates every area of our life. And like I said, the unfortunate reality is so many of us never learn to move beyond it and move past it. And so the question that I want to ask tonight, the tension that I want us to wrestle with is this, can I really overcome the rejection that I experience in life? Is it actually possible? And if so, how? Or even more importantly, how does my relationship with God, or how does a relationship with God actually take me to a place where I can overcome the impact of rejection in my life? Can God really help me with this? And if he can, how? And that's the question that I want to answer for us tonight. And I want to take us into a passage found in the book of 1 Peter chapter 2. And before we get into it, I want to give a little bit of context on this passage. 1 Peter, it was written by a guy named Peter. Pretty simple. Peter was one of Jesus' closest friends. He was with Jesus from the very beginning of his ministry. He would have experienced almost everything that Jesus experienced. I mean, Peter was right there for the ride. And so Peter and Jesus, very close friends. And Peter is now writing. After Jesus has been crucified and risen from the dead and gone back into heaven. Peter is now kind of pastoring local churches in the area, and he's writing to this group of Christians, this church, who's experiencing a lot of persecution and suffering, who they themselves were actually rejected. Because in that time, because of the political powers in play, being a Christian was not a very popular thing to be. And so these Christians experienced a lot of rejection from family, from their community, because of the unpopularity of the decision of choosing to be a Christian. And so Peter is writing to this group now. And he's like, listen up, here's what I got to say. And so we're going to pick up the story in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. And he says this, he's to this group of people. He says, you are coming to Christ, who is the living cornerstone of God's temple. He was rejected by people, but he was chosen by God for great honor. I want to pause right there. So here's what Peter's saying, writing to this group of rejected, suffering Christians. He says, you're coming to Jesus now. And Jesus knows what rejection is like. And you say, how does Jesus know what rejection is like? Really, if we could sum up Jesus' life, it's one big never-ending cycle of rejection. It almost seems like everywhere he went, Jesus was rejected by some group of people. In John's account of Jesus, in John chapter 7, John tells us this, that even Jesus' own brothers, his own family, dismissed him and refused to believe him. They thought he was whacked. They were like, Jesus, you are not who you say that you are. You're not the Son of God. I mean, come on, how many of you, if you had siblings that claimed to be the Son of God, you'd be like, dude, you've lost your mind. So Jesus knew what it was like to be rejected by family. And in Matthew's account of Jesus, in Matthew chapter 13, he tells us that Jesus actually went back to his hometown to begin to preach and teach and start to do miracles there. And when he got there, it says the people in his own community, the families that he would have grown up with, the people that he would have known from the very beginning of his life, they took offense at what he had to say. And the story tells us that Jesus actually had to leave his own town, and he referred to himself as a prophet without honor because he just couldn't do anything there. They were very hostile. They turned their back on Jesus. And again, these are people that Jesus would have known, that they would have been close family friends. He would have grown up with him. And so Jesus knew what it was like to experience rejection from family. He knew what it was like to experience rejection from community. Jesus also knew what it was like to experience rejection from two of his closest friends. The last couple days of Jesus' life, Jesus was actually betrayed by one of his 12 disciples named Judas, who sold him out for 30 pieces of silver and told the soldiers, hey, this is where you can find him. And that's kind of what sparked Jesus going to the cross and being put to death. But he was sold out by one of his closest friends. And then, ironically enough, the guy who writes this book, Peter, 3 different times as Jesus is being tortured and being sent to sentencing to be put to death on the cross. You know, he's sitting there and people see Peter in the crowd and they're like, hey, you're one of his friends, right? Like, we've seen you with him before. And Peter's like, guys, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know this guy. I've never seen him. Leave me alone. I don't want to be associated with him. And it didn't just happen one time. It happened 3 different times. And so Jesus knows what it was like to experience rejection here, to experience betrayal. I mean, how many of you can relate with that, being betrayed by someone close to you? Man, it hurts. And Peter is saying to this group of Christians, this is who you're coming to. You're coming to Jesus who knows what you're going through, who can sympathize with the emotions that you're experiencing right now. And he was rejected by people, but God chose him for great honor. And so let's pick back up in the passage here, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 7. And it says this, you who trust him, you recognize the honor that God has given him. But for those who reject him, the stone that the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. We'll talk about that in 1 minute. Let's finish out this passage here. And it says, you are a chosen people. You are a royal priest, a holy nation, God's very own possession. And as a result, you can show others the goodness of God. For he called you out of the darkness and into his wonderful light. Okay, what's Peter talking about here? What we see here in this passage is not so much the emotion of rejections. We're not seeing what Jesus felt during the times that he was betrayed or he was turned down by family or community, because, I think we all know what that feels like, right? How many of you in this room could say, I can empathize with rejection because I've experienced that at some point in my life, right? Yeah, that's not what this passage talks about. But what's so significant to me about what Peter is writing here is that we get a perspective of what the rejection of Jesus was like here on earth, but we get that perspective through God's eyes. And we get to see the results of Jesus' life in spite of the rejection that he experienced here on earth. Because in this passage, man, God is comparing perspectives. He's saying, Jesus, nobody wanted him. They rejected him. They put him to death. But he's saying, you know what? I chose him for great honor and was able to do something with that. It didn't matter if he was rejected. People dismissed his message. They cast him out. They said, put him to death. But you know what? God elevated him. God established him. And there were people who saw Jesus who didn't want to accept his message, didn't want to believe it, didn't affirm it. And God is saying, in spite of the rejection that Jesus experienced here on earth, this is what I chose to do in life. And what we can learn through a passage like this is that God is able to do something incredible in your life despite the rejection that you have experienced in your life. And so ultimately, what we see here is that God's opinion won the day. Yeah, people rejected Jesus. They wanted nothing to do with him. But he says God chose him for great honor, and he's become the cornerstone. And ultimately, it was God's opinion that won the day. And this leads us to the main idea of our message, which is this. When I face rejection, I can either focus on what other people think, or I can learn how to live out of the opinion of God. Can we say that together here? When I face rejection, I can focus on what other people think, or I can learn how to live out of the opinion of God. I can learn how to live out of the opinion of God. Why is this way so much better, right? Why is it so much better to live out of the opinion of God than to kind of be tied down to what people think? And here's what I know, that if we constantly live under the umbrella of what other people think, if we constantly live under the umbrella of people's opinions, of trying to win their approval, rejection will become a constant and a dominating force in your life. Why? People have opinions, don't they? How many of you know people have opinions, right? People have opinions. People have expectations. And at some point in your life, it is inevitable. Someone in the heat of a moment, someone you care about, someone whose approval you desperately are seeking, will say something to you, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that is rejective in nature, that will wound you to your core. Or they will do something to you, again, whether intentional or unintentional, that hurts you to your core. And if the approval of people and the approval of certain individuals in your life is all that you're seeking, and that's what your chief aim is, then rejection becomes a constant dominating force in your life. But if, on the other hand, we could learn how to live out of the truth of the opinion of God for our lives, it would be transformative. It would change our lives. It would free us up emotionally. Because rather than being hinged to the opinions of people whose emotions change constantly, people whose opinions change constantly. I mean, how many of you know we're all fickle, aren't we? We change, every single day. That's just the way emotions and feelings work. Rather than being hinged to the approval of someone who you never know how their mood is going to be, man, when you can put your approval in a God who says God is constant, that he never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. When we can put our trust in that opinion and seek that approval and learn to live out of his opinion for our lives, it becomes transformative. And what it does, it begins to allow God to do whatever he wants to do in our lives, because rather than be limited by the opinions of other people and what they see in us, what they may think about us, and what they maybe have done to us in the past, and we're scared to step out again because, I'm not sure, I don't want to get hurt like that again. Rather than be limited by that and be hindered in life and never be able to get out of the shadow or the umbrella of what people have done or said to you in the past, if we can learn how to live out of the opinion of God, it's truly transforming. It frees us up emotionally. There's no more pressure to try and please people because we're living out of the opinion of God for our lives. And if we live out of this, man, it really establishes us. And I love what God is showing us here in this passage in 1 Peter. He's showing us through Jesus' life what he is able to accomplish in the life of someone who is not tied down by people's opinions or who lives their life constantly trying to seek the approval of people, but rather lives out of the opinion of God. God's showing us what he's able to accomplish in a life that, I don't care what people think. God, what do you think? And we see that God's able to do something incredible. Because I love the play on words that we see here in verse 7, where he says, the stone that the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. And the stone is referring to Jesus. And he's saying this Jesus who was rejected has now become the cornerstone. And if you know anything about masonry, man, the cornerstone, I don't know anything about it. I just Googled it, and let me tell you, it's pretty cool. When you Google teaches you a lot of things you don't know. Isn't Google great? Oh, man. But, so I Googled this, right? And the cornerstone is the most important stone set when you're building any type of foundation or you're building any type of structure, because that cornerstone was the first stone that was set. It was a 90-degree stone, and the positioning of that stone would determine everything else about the positioning of that structure or the house, because that stone set the direction, it set the positioning, it set the alignment, it set the stability, and ultimately it set the longevity of that structure. Everything was based on that cornerstone. And God is saying, the stone that the builders rejected, the person of Jesus, who no one wanted, who everyone dismissed, who everyone thought, just put him to death, please, his message, we're over it, we're done with it. That person right there, God's saying, I wasn't limited by what people's opinions were here on earth. Look what I was able to do with Jesus' life. I've now made him the cornerstone of the foundation of this whole thing that we call Christianity. It hinges on one person, Jesus, who was rejected on earth, but God was still able to do something beautiful and incredible with his life, to where Jesus can say, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me, because Jesus now becomes the foundation and the cornerstone of this whole thing that we call Christianity. And what Jesus' life shows us in this passage, he demonstrates for us that it is possible to overcome the rejection and the opinions of other people and still live a life of meaning and significance in this world. Isn't that good news? That I don't have to be limited by what my parents may think of me. I don't have to be limited by what that family member or what that friend said about me 15 years ago and that label that I've been carrying. I don't have to be limited by that. Because Jesus' life now demonstrates for us that it is possible to live a life of meaning, to live a life of significance, and to be used by God in an incredible way despite a tremendous amount of rejection experienced here on earth. And I don't know about you, but man, that encourages me. That encourages me. And it's not just Jesus, because if the passage just stopped here and it was like, cool, it was Jesus who did this, we'd be like, okay, great, but I'm still bound here, and I still am living under the pressure of other people and what they think. Peter then begins to flip it, and he says this, if we can throw verse 9 back there on the screen. He says, you are a chosen people. You're royal priests. He now begins to flip the switch, and he says, listen to who you are. You're a holy nation. You're God's very own possession, and as a result, you can now show others the goodness of God, for he's called you out of the darkness and into his wonderful light. So he's saying this isn't just Jesus who was able to overcome the opinions of people and be used in a significant way in life. But no, this is actually you. This is true about you. And what Peter knew about rejection was that at its core, rejection, when we experience it, it really compromises or it challenges us. It challenges our identity, right? Because the core feeling of rejection is being unwanted. And when you feel like you're unwanted or you're not accepted by someone, maybe it's in a marriage or some kind of relationship, and you feel unwanted, man, that becomes your identity. You begin to wear that around, and that begins to permeate every area of your life. And we wear that around as a label. And so Peter understood, okay, you're rejected, but let me start to breathe some identity into you. Let me start to tell you a little bit about who you are. And he says, you're a chosen people. He says, you're holy. You're royalty. You were called, you were created with purpose. And he begins to say, hey, this is the new label. This is the new identity that God wants to give you. And I want to say this, if you're in this room and you've experienced rejection, painful rejection, if there have been things that have just kind of been ruminating in your mind this entire message, I want to say this to you, that God has called you with greater purpose. That there is a new identity that he can give you here tonight. And he wants to undo the labels that you have worn for years because of things that people have done or have said in the past. And he wants to put new identity on you. Because, man, living this way, living out of the opinion of God really is the best way. Because it's so transformative. It's so freeing. And so how do we learn to do this? Because it's a nice, easy thing to say, okay, cool, live out of the opinions of God. But Kyler, you don't understand. I've got these things that people have said about me for years, and they just keep rattling. And every time I want to step out, and every time I want to do something, and every time I feel like God's called me, go do this thing, I am hindered and I am chained because of the things that people have said about me in the past. So how do I really learn how to live out of the opinion of God if it really is that transforming? And it all starts with this, understanding the way that God really feels about you. Understanding what his opinion of you really, really is. And he lays it out for us in this passage, and we'll break it down. But here's the thing. I'm not just talking about a 30,000, foot view of God, big picture stuff, and he's all the way up there, and he's like, yeah, that guy, I love him there. He's chosen, he's called. No, I'm talking about the God who sees you in the midst of your mess, who comes down to earth and sees you in the midst of your pain, in the midst of the addiction, in the midst of the habits or the hang-ups. Do you have that God who sees all of that, not just the big picture, but also all the pain and the hurt, and says, you know what? This is still the identity that I choose to place on you. This is still who I choose to say that you are, because I'm going to tell you this. Some of you need to hear this tonight, that there are things about you that are true which override the opinions that you have about yourself. Most days we don't wake up feeling chosen. We don't wake up feeling loved. We don't wake up feeling accepted. But man, there is a God in heaven who says, despite the way that you feel about yourself, it doesn't matter if you felt this way about yourself for a long time, there are things that are true about you which override what you think about yourself. And can I even say it, that there are things that are true that override what the opinions of other people are about you. And we can either choose to live out of the identity that others have spoken on us, others have spoken over us, and the rejection that they've labeled us with, or we can say, you know what, God, what is that opinion? I want to learn to live into that. And really, when people have said or done things to us, like I said, it becomes a label that we wear. And they're lies. Because again, there's things that are true about you that we often don't step into or walk into, but there's things that are true regardless of what other people say or what you think, feel, or believe about yourself. But we walk around carrying these lies. And so the way that we learn to live out of the opinion of God is we begin to replace the lies with the truth about what God says about us. We begin to take off that label and say, all right, God, what's the new label that you have for me? And in this passage, we'll very quickly go through four declarations to overcome rejection. And these are really like identity statements that we can kind of beat into our spirits and punch into our chest that become empowering for life, that become the kind of things that begin to teach us how to live out of the opinion of God. And the first one is this. It says, I am chosen by God, and he will never reject me. I'm chosen by God, and he will never reject me. We get this idea out of verses 9 and 10 where Peter says, you are a chosen people, you're a royal priest, a holy nation. And he says this, once you had no identity as a people, but now you're God's people. And we could say this whole point this way, that rejection in the eyes of God does not define your status. The rejection you've experienced here on earth does not define your status in the eyes of God. I love sports. I love sports analogies. So think of it this way, right? Who remembers being picked for sports as a kid? You're all lined up on a wall, and it's the worst feeling if you're bad at sports. It's like, oh, please don't pick me last. But, man, you're there. Everyone's lined up on the wall, and God's looking. He's like, okay, who do I want on my team? And he picks you as the first pick. It's not like the last pity pick that you get just because, all right, no one else is standing here. All right, I guess I'll take Kyler. How many of you know that's the worst feeling in the world, getting picked last for something? But no, man, the idea behind God choosing you is that he looks at that whole lineup and he says, you right there, I want you. I want you on my team. You right there, I want you on my team. I've chosen you. And he says, I don't really care. I've seen the mess. I've seen everything, because again, I'm not just 30,000 feet up in the air, not really involved in your world. I see the mess. I see the hurt. I see what you wrestle with every single day. But despite all of that, I still want you. I still want you. I've chosen you. I'm not going to reject you. And the things that have happened in your life, that doesn't define your status in my eyes. And man, how encouraging is that to know that the person whose opinion matters the most wants me? Because God's opinion matters about more than anyone else's. And to know that the person whose opinion matters most, he wants me. I don't know about you, but that's incredibly freeing. And it helps me to begin to live free from other people's opinions, because I know, you know what? God has chosen me. So it doesn't define my status. Number two, we could throw that I am purchased by God, and he will protect me. Or we could say it this way, that rejection, it doesn't define my worth. It says in verse 9 that you are God's possession. So let's go back to the sports analogy for a minute. Everybody lined up on the wall. God's like, you know what? I choose you. But this whole idea of being purchased is like, okay, this ain't just a pickup game of kickball now. This is God putting out on the line there, like the multi-million-dollar max contract deal that, like, if anyone watches baseball, Mike Trout got a $430 million deal. I mean, insane amount of money. But God's saying, no, I'm not just picking this guy. I'm paying for this guy because I want him that badly. And you say, okay, how on earth has God purchased me? Man, God thought you were so worth it that he gave his own son to die on the cross for you, to purchase your forgiveness and to purchase your eternity because he loves you just that much. And man, I don't know about you, but why? Why would I want to live out of anyone else's opinion who thinks any less of me rather than living out of the opinion of God? Who is not naive in his opinion of me because he's unremoved from my world, who sees all of the mess, all of the hurt, all of the pain, and says, despite it all, I still want you. And not only do I want you, man, I gave my own son on the cross for you. Why would I not want to live out of that opinion for my life? Why would I want to choose to stay limited by the opinion of people for me when there is a God in heaven who says, you are worth everything to me, and here's the way that I feel about you? Why wouldn't I want to step into that? Because that's hope. That's hope for the future. That's unchaining yourself from rejection in the past and saying, no, I'm stepping into this because there's a God in heaven who not only says that I'm chosen and that I'm worth it, but man, he says I'm purchased, and man, my status is unaffected in his eyes. And the third thing we can draw right out of this passage, this fourth declaration or third declaration we can make, I am called by God to shine his light in the darkness. And it says in verse 9, it says, as a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he's called you out of the darkness and into his wonderful light. We could say it this way as well, rejection, it doesn't define my purpose. The people who have rejected you in the past, the people who have said things to you, the way that you've been wounded and it feels like, man, you've just been chained and limited for so long, that does not define the purpose for your life. God is still able to do incredible things in your life because he took a rejected Jesus and he used him for something significant. Imagine what he could do through you. Imagine what he could do through your life. Because I'll say this, what God is able to do in your life is not limited by or based on the opinions of other people. And thank God for that. Because man, if what God was able to accomplish in my life was based on the things that friends said about me years ago, or even, past relationships, what people have said about me years ago, then I'd be a mess. I'd be stuck. But man, I'm thankful that what God is able to do in my life is not limited by or based on the opinions of other people, but he's able to overcome that and say, no, I still have a life of significance for you. You're still called to shine my light in the darkness because I still have purpose for your life. And this is really what God specializes in doing. He takes things that are broken, situations that are broken, people that have been hurt, dejected, feel hopeless, and he says, I can make something beautiful out of that if you trust me with your life. I promise I can do something incredible. The wounds of rejection that have hurt you for so long, I can still do something amazing with that. Your purpose hasn't been thrown away. I've still created you and I've called you with purpose. Isn't that good news? And the last declaration we can make is this, and the band can begin to make their way back on stage here. I have received mercy, and God will heal my wounds. I've received mercy, and God will heal my wounds. And right in verse 10, as he ends this passage, he says this, once you had received mercy, but now, once you had received no mercy, but now you have received God's mercy. And here's the idea behind this, that rejection in your life, it doesn't have to stick. The things that people have said that have wounded you to your core, the labels that have been placed on you since you were a young child, the feelings of unwantedness, maybe the times of abandonment or the betrayal that you've experienced, that rejection, it doesn't have to stick. Because in the person of Jesus Christ, there is healing available not only for the physical sicknesses that we have, but man, for the heart that has been wounded, for the soul that has been cut to the core because of what other people have said. And so, man, when we begin to declare these things, this is the new identity that God's trying to place on us, that we've been chosen. He'll never reject us. That's confidence right there. But, man, we've been purchased. We've been called with purpose That our pain has not been wasted, that God's still able to bring something beautiful out of that. But also this idea that the rejection in life, it doesn't have to stick, because there is a God who heals and is able to take the wounds that have affected us and is able to bring some kind of beauty out of them. Isn't that good news? And so here's how I want to end the message here, like this. If you're comfortable bowing your heads, closing your eyes. And, in the final analysis, when we look back in life, it really doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. Because what matters ultimately is what God thinks, his opinion of you, what he's chosen to say about you. And he's laid it all out right here. He says, this is how I feel about you. There's no questions asked. There's no stipulations to that. He says, I went to the cross for you. I died for you. I know that you've done these things. I see the hurt. I see the pain. But you know what? It doesn't matter to me. But he says, you've got to trust me. You've got to trust me with the pain. You've got to trust me with the rejection. And if we go back to that idea of the cornerstone, where once you build your life on that, everything else becomes aligned and stable, and there's direction. Well, that's why we can build our life on the person of Jesus Christ. And when we put our trust in him, that's how we're able to begin to endure the rejection that we experience, because we're placing our life and our trust in a person who's lived that before, but not only lived it before, has now provided direction, stability, and everything else that we need to be able to endure the rejection that we'll experience in life. And so the invitation, before we do any kind of prayer application or anything like that, the question I want to ask, if there's anyone in this room who's like, you know what, this relationship with God that you're talking about tonight, and what he's able to do in my life, and this whole idea of trusting Jesus, I'm not quite sure I've done that yet. I'm not quite sure I've given my life over to him and surrendered everything to him and said, all right, God, you're my Savior. I give you my life. Well, if that's you in this room, every head is bowed and every eye is closed. I want to give you an opportunity to do that, because I tell you, it's the greatest decision you'll ever make, and there is healing available in the person of Jesus. The identity that I was speaking about tonight, the new label, God wants to give that to you tonight. I believe that. You've walked in here carrying labels of hurt, labels of pain, shame, and rejection, and I believe that God tonight wants that you can walk out of the room free from that. And that happens because of the healing that is available in the person of Jesus Christ. And so if you not yet made that decision to trust him and give your life over to him, then I want to give you an opportunity to do that. Every head is bowed, every eye is closed, and if that's you, you're in here and you're like, you know what, I think I want to give my life to Jesus. And I want everything that you're talking about here tonight. I want to be forgiven of my sins, and I want eternal life with God. If that's you here tonight, I'm just going to ask right now on the count of 3 that you'd raise your hands. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, I see a couple of those hands. That's awesome. And what I want to do now is lead you in a prayer of salvation. And these aren't magic words or anything like that, but the Bible says this, that all you need to do to begin a relationship with the person of Jesus is to believe in your heart and confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord. And so what I want to do now is lead you in a prayer of salvation. And just so you don't feel isolated, I'm going to ask the whole room to repeat after me just as one body here. And we're going to pray. But man, again, these aren't magic words. Believe these in your heart and confess it out loud enough for your ears to hear. Let me lead you now in this prayer. Let's say, Dear Jesus, thank you for dying on the cross for me. God, thank you that I don't have to be limited by wounds of rejection in the past. But God, today I choose to give my life to you. I declare that I need you. God, I want to be in a relationship with you. And today I declare that you're my Savior. And I want eternal life with you, God. I want to be forgiven of my sins. I want to give you my whole life. And I want today to be the day that I remember for the rest of my life. I give you everything, Jesus. I surrender it all to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.